This movie is about sharing documents, and specifically it's about merging shared copies of a document, of a workbook, of course. The first thing we're going to do is take a look at the document inspector, as well as the compatibility and accessibility inspector. And then we'll take a look at the locked method, which is the default way that multiple people utilize the same workbook. And then we'll look at merging workbooks, which are shared copies of the same workbook that can be pooled together to come up with a final result in one workbook. So we're just going to go right into this movie utilizing this workbook with the clip art of the two people sharing a drink. And we're going to go back and inspect this document. To do that, left-click the File tab, and in the Info area, in the Prepare for Sharing group, there's a drop-down that says Check for Issues. The first thing we can do is inspect the document. I'm going to left-click that. And before the document inspector runs, if you haven't saved your workbook, you'll get this message from Excel asking you if you want to save the workbook. I'm going to left-click Yes. And then I get another message. It's a warning message. It says this document contains macros, ActiveX controls, XML expansion pack information, or web components. These may include personal information that cannot be removed by the document inspector. I'm going to acknowledge that and left-click OK. And there's something else that you may want to do, and that's create a backup copy of the document, because when you run this document inspector, it's going to call out items that are on this list if you have a checkbox next to the item, and then give you the option to remove the problem. So there's 7 areas that the document inspector will run a check on. The first is comments and annotations. You may have some embedded comments, some tracked information about changes that have taken place in the workbook that still have people's comments and input that you may want to strip out of the document before you send this out to other people. You may have some personal information stored in the properties or the metadata. You may have some custom XML data stored. You may have some headers and footers set up for printing the worksheets that you may want to strip out. You may want to unhide hidden rows and columns. If it's a large workbook, those kind of things can be a little difficult to keep up with unless you check for them before you send this workbook out. You may want them displayed to the recipients. Same thing with hidden worksheets. And lastly, you may have some invisible content. I had a workbook one time that had about 95,000 items of invisible content. I'm not exactly sure to this day what it was, but it was a workbook that was built with a lot of data that was from other sources. And sometimes you can collect a lot of extraneous content in your workbook. This will find it and strip it out for you. So I'm going to left-click Inspect, and I get a clean result on all of these. The next thing you can check for is accessibility. Accessibility has to do with establishing text for images, using a name for a worksheet that's meaningful instead of the default Sheet 1, Sheet 2, Sheet 3. And it's to make the workbook more user-friendly for people with disabilities. I'm going to left-click Check Accessibility. I'm taken back to Sheet 1, and I get the accessibility checker pane that tells me I'm missing alternative text on the picture. It's the picture we're looking at of the couple. And the default sheet names are used to name the worksheets. I'm going to close that and go backstage one more time. The last thing that we can check for is compatibility. The compatibility has to do with features you used in Excel 2010 in this case that may not be features that are applicable or available in prior versions of Excel. If you're sending your workbook to somebody else that's in a prior version of Excel, you can use this compatibility checker so that you can become aware of the things that won't work for those recipients. And we've already done a movie on the compatibility checker, so I'm not going to go into details on this. I'm going to left-click OK. So I've run all my checks on my workbook, and I'm, of course, in a different workbook now. And I'm ready to put it out on a network and make it available to multiple users. The default behavior for the workbook, unless you change it, is to allow read-write access by one user at a time. And since I have this workbook open, I'm going to open up another instance of Excel. And it tells me Book 1 because I'm in another instance, so I actually have 2 instances, each one with Book 1 open. So I'm going to try to open the other Book 1 that's open in the other instance of Excel by going to Alt-F-R, Recent, left-clicking that one, and Excel tells me the file is in use. I can open it up as read-only, and then save a separate copy for myself, or I can have Excel notify me when the workbook is available for read-write access for me. I'm going to go back to the other instance of Excel and close the workbook, and then go back to the second instance of Excel, where now I got a message that says the file is now available. It's now available for editing. Choose read-write to open it for editing. I can left-click that, and now I can edit the workbook. So a second alternative that we have to sort of broaden the scope of the people that can gain access to our workbook is to make multiple copies of it and send those copies out to individuals where they can update their copy, and then when you receive their copy back, you can merge all of their content into one uniform workbook. That obviously might be good for companies trying to develop a budget and to use a master worksheet to pool information from a lot of different people. So how do we do this? I'm going to only make one copy of this workbook, and it's a blank workbook, but we go to the Review tab, and then left-click Share Workbook in the Changes group, and then check that box that says Allow changes by more than one user at a time. This also allows workbook merging, which is what we want to do. I'm going to left-click OK. Excel tells me this action will now save the workbook. I'm going to acknowledge that. And Book 1 is now shared, and Excel tells me that. So I'm now going to save a copy by pressing Alt-F-A, Save As. And this is Book 1 copy. I'm going to save it on my desktop. And then I'm going to put some content in here. Not much, and we don't need much to make the point. And then I'm going to save the workbook and then close it, and then open up the workbook that we want to merge that content into. So I have my master version and my copy saved. Well, the next thing you have to do is add a command button to the Quick Access Toolbar or to the ribbon. And I think it's probably a little odd that this isn't available by default, because you can set up the merging functionality, but you can't utilize it until you add this command button. So we're going to customize the Quick Access Toolbar. Left-click Commands Not in the ribbon. Scroll down and look for Compare and Merge Workbooks. Add that to the Quick Access Toolbar, and then left-click OK. So this enables us to, once we have a shared workbook, merge copies of the workbook, and we had a macro-enabled workbook, and there it is, Book 1 copy. Select it, left-click OK, and the content that's in that workbook is pulled into this workbook with an annotation that tells me who did what on what date at what time and what they did. So I'm going to save this. And to get rid of those annotations, go back to the Share Workbook command and clear that checkbox and left-click OK. And I get a warning saying that the change history will be erased. That's fine. That's what we want. And other users that are editing this workbook will not be able to save their changes. So if you haven't gotten all the changes in yet, you won't be able to pull in any more changes from any more copies of the workbook. So you have to time this after you pull in all the data that people have submitted to you. I'm going to left-click Yes, because that's what we want to do. So that's sharing and merging a workbook. We first ran the document inspector, which allows us to check for numerous things that may be issues if we're sending our document out to other people. We can also have Excel scan the document for accessibility issues and for compatibility issues. We then looked at the lock method, which is the default method of quote-unquote sharing a workbook, where it is open to only one user exclusively at a time. And then we looked at the merging workbooks functionality, where we can make copies of our workbook, have it updated by various people, and then merge those changes into our original workbook.